HMAS Melbourne was a Majestic-class light aircraft carrier of the Royal Australian Navy, operating from 1955 until 1982. She was the third and final conventional aircraft carrier to serve in the RAN. Melbourne was the only British Commonwealth naval vessel to sink two friendly warships in peacetime collisions. The ship was laid down for the Royal Navy as the lead ship of the Majestic-class in April 1943, and was launched as HMS Majestic in February 1945. At the end of World War II, work on the ship was suspended until she was purchased by the RAN in 1947. At the time of purchase, it was decided to incorporate new aircraft carrier technologies into the design, making Melbourne the third ship to be constructed with an angled flight deck. Delays in construction and integrating the enhancements meant that the carrier was not commissioned until 1955. Melbourne never fired a shot in anger during her career, having only peripheral, non-combat roles in relation to the Indonesia-Malaysia Confrontation and the Vietnam War. She was, however, involved in two major collisions with Allied vessels. The first occurred on the evening of the 10th of February 1964, in which Melbourne rammed and sank the RAN destroyer HMAS Voyager when the latter altered course across her bow. 82 of Voyager's personnel were killed, and 2 royal commissions were held to investigate the incident. The second occurred in the early morning of the 3rd of June 1969, when Melbourne also rammed and sank the United States Navy destroyer Frankie Evans in similar circumstances. 74 American personnel died, and a joint US and RAN Board of Inquiry was held. These incidents, along with several minor collisions, shipboard accidents, and aircraft losses, led to the reputation that Melbourne was jinxed. Melbourne was paid off from RAN service in 1982. A proposal to convert her for use as a floating casino failed, and a 1984 sale was cancelled, before she was sold for scrap in 1985 and towed to China for breaking. The scrapping was delayed so Melbourne could be studied by the People's Liberation Army Navy as part of a secret project to develop the Chinese aircraft carrier and used to train plan aviators in carrier flight operations. Construction and acquisition. Melbourne was constructed by Vickers Armstrongs at the Naval Construction Yard in Barrow-in-Furness, England. The ship was laid down as HMS Majestic on 15 April 1943, and was launched on 28 February 1945 by Lady Anderson, the wife of Sir John Anderson, the British Chancellor of the Exchequer. Following the end of World War II, the Admiralty ordered the suspension of many British shipbuilding projects, including the fitting out of Majestic and her 5 sister ships. Construction resumed in 1946, and major modifications to the design were incorporated. A review by the Australian government's Defence Committee held after World War II recommended that the post-war forces of the RAN be structured around a task force incorporating multiple aircraft carriers. Initial plans were for 3 carriers with 2 active and a third in reserve, although funding cuts led to the purchase of only 2 carriers in June 1947, Majestic and sister ship HMS Terrible, for the combined cost of £2.75 million, plus stores, fuel, and ammunition. As Terrible was the closer of the 2 ships to completion, she was finished without modification, and was commissioned into the RAN on 16 December 1948 as HMAS Sydney. Work progressed on Majestic at a slower rate, as she was upgraded with the latest technology and equipment. The Colossus-class carrier HMS Vengeance was loaned to the RAN from 13 November 1952 until 12 August 1955 to cover Majestic's absence, labour difficulties, late delivery of equipment equipment, additional requirements for Australian operations, and the prioritisation of merchant shipping over naval construction delayed the completion of Majestic. Incorporation of the new systems and enhancements caused the cost of the RAN carrier acquisition program to increase to £8.3 million. Construction and fitting out did not finish until October 1955. As the carrier neared completion, a commissioning crew was formed in Australia and first used to return Vengeance to the United Kingdom. The completed carrier was commissioned into the run as HMAS Majestic on 26 October 1955. 2 days later, the ship was renamed Melbourne by Lady White, the wife of Sir Thomas White, the Australian High Commissioner to the United Kingdom, and recommissioned. Design. As the lead ship of the Majestic class of light aircraft carriers, Melbourne was conceived as a modified version of the Colossus-class carrier, incorporating improvements in flight deck design and habitability. Majestic and Colossus-class carriers were almost identical in hull design, and both were considered subclasses of the 1942 designed light aircraft carrier program. These carriers were intended as disposable warships, to be disposed of at the end of World War II or within 3 years of entering service. Melbourne had a standard displacement of 15,740 long tons, which increased to 20,000 long tons at full load. At launch, the carrier was 213.97 meters long overall, but this was increased by 2.43 meters during a refit in 1969. She had a beam of 24.38 meters and a draft of 7.62 meters. Melbourne's two propellers were driven by two Parsons single reduction gear turbine sets providing 40,000 shp, which were powered by 4 Admiralty 3-drum boilers. The carrier could achieve a top speed of 24 knots and a range of 12,000 nautical miles at 14 knots or 6,200 nautical miles at 23 knots. The size of the ship's company averaged 1,350 officers and sailors, including 350 personnel from the embarked Fleet Air Arm squadrons. Modifications during construction. Following the recommencement of construction, modifications were made to the ship, based on wartime experience and Britain's post-war carrier warfare technology and innovations. These included an angled flight deck, steam catapult and a mirror landing aid, making Melbourne the third aircraft carrier to be constructed with these features, instead of having them added later. The main modifications centered around the need to operate jet aircraft, which were larger and heavier than those that the carrier was originally designed for. The flight deck was angled 5.5 degrees left of the carrier's centerline, to allow for the simultaneous launch and recovery of aircraft. Despite an increase to approximately 1 acre in area, the deck was still significantly smaller than other Cold War-era carriers' S2 trackers, with the 22.12-meter wingspan, had less than a meter's clearance for the starboard wingtip when landing, and pilots from other navies often refused to attempt landing. Water rationing was required in the early years of the carrier's operation, as the ship's fresh water supply was insufficient to freely provide for the steam catapult propulsion turbines and crew. The flight deck, hangar deck and aircraft lifts were strengthened, and reinforced arrestor cables were installed. Flight direction radar was included, making Melbourne the only military airfield in the Australasian region at the time capable of operating aircraft at night and in poor weather. Refits. Early in her her career, Melbourne underwent a series of short annual refits, commencing in September and ending in January or February of the next year. As time passed, the refits increased in duration or replaced by major upgrades or overhauls. Melbourne's first major refit started in December 1967 and continued until February 1969, during which she was upgraded to operate S-2 Tracker and A-4 Skyhawk aircraft. The modifications cost $8.5 million, and included an overhaul of the hull and machinery, strengthening of the flight deck, improvements to the catapult and arrestor cables, modification of the aviation fuel systems and flight control arrangements, and upgrades of the navigational aids and radar. Air conditioning systems and a liquid oxygen generation plant were also installed. Melbourne re-entered service at the conclusion of the refits on the 14th of February, and performed sea trials in Jervis Bay from the 17th of February until the 5th of May. This was the largest project undertaken by Garden Island Dockyard to the date. The next major refit was required in 1971 for the scheduled rebuilding of the catapult, which was only possible after components were sourced from HMCS Bonaventure and AS Coral Sea. The flight deck was again reinforced and strengthened, and attempts were made to increase the effectiveness of the air conditioning system installed in 1969. Melbourne had been designed to operate in North Atlantic and Arctic climates, and the original ventilation systems were inappropriate for her primary operating climate, the tropics. The 1969 and 1971 refits did improve conditions, although there was little scope for upgrade, and the system was still inadequate. Temperatures inside the ship continued to reach over 65 degrees Celsius, and on one occasion a hold reached 78 degrees Celsius. The refit took 7 months to complete, and cost $2 million. More large-scale refits occurred throughout the rest of the 1970s. Melbourne was back in dock from November 1972 until August 1973, with further work done to her catapult. The next major refit ran from April 1975 to June 1976, and was intended to increase the operational lifespan of the carrier to at least 1985. The refit was lengthened by industrial action at the dockyard. Melbourne underwent another refit from late 1978 until August 1979. A refit scheduled to begin in late 1981 was postponed in September until a decision regarding the new carrier was made, then cancelled in January 1982, after the announcement that the RAN would be acquiring HMS Invincible. Armament. Melbourne carried a defensive armament of anti-aircraft guns and an air group comprising both attack and anti-submarine aircraft. As the ship was never directly involved in a conflict, her weapons and embarked aircraft did not fire a shot in anger. Weapons and systems. Melbourne's initial armament included 25 40mm Bofors anti-aircraft guns, 6 twin and 13 single mountings. The radar suite consisted of 3 Type 277Q height-finding sets, a Type 293Q surface search set, and a Type 978 navigational set. Between entering service in 1959, 4 of the single Bofors were removed. During the 1967 to 1969 refit, 13 Bofors were removed, leaving 4 twin and 4 single mountings. The 3 277Q radars were replaced with updated American and Dutch designs, ALW-02 air search set and ASPN-35 landing aid radar. A TACAN aerial and electronic countermeasures pods were also installed during this refit. The 4 Bofors twin mountings were removed in 1980. Aircraft. Melbourne carried 3 Fleet Air Arm squadrons. Initially, she had up to 22 planes and 2 helicopters embarked at any time. The number of aircraft gradually increased until 1972, when the air group peaked at 27 aircraft. Approximately 350 Fleet Air Arm personnel were stationed aboard the carrier. Initially, 2 types of fixed-wing aircraft were operated from Melbourne: De Havilland Sea Venom FAW. 53 fighter aircraft were flown by 805 Squadron RAN and 808 Squadron RAN, while Fairey Gannet anti-submarine strike aircraft were operated by 816 Squadron RAN and 817 Squadron RAN. At the time of their arrival, the Sea Venoms were the only radar-equipped all-weather combat aircraft in the Southern Hemisphere. At Melbourne's commissioning, the standard air group consisted of 8 Sea Venoms and 2 squadrons of 8 Gannets, with 2 Bristol Sycamore search and rescue helicopters added shortly after the carrier entered service. These aircraft were due to become obsolete in the late 1950s, and the RAN considered purchasing modern aircraft of French or Italian design, which were better suited to light carrier operations than equivalent British aircraft, or replace Melbourne with a larger carrier. Instead of pursuing either alternative, the Australian government announced in 1959 that Melbourne would be reconfigured during her 1963 refit to operate as a helicopter carrier. The fixed-wing aircraft of the Fleet Air Arm were marked for replacement by 27 Westland Wessex anti-submarine helicopters, a reduction of embarked plane numbers to 4 Sea Venoms and 6 Gannets, along with regular rotation and careful use of the aircraft, extended the service life until the mid-1960s, while the size of the air group was maintained by carrying up to 10 Wessex helicopters. The decision to retire the fixed-wing component of the Fleet Air Arm was rescinded in 1963, and on the 10th of November 1964, a £212 million increase in defence spending included the purchase of new aircraft for Melbourne. The RAN planned to acquire 14 Grumman S-2E Tracker anti-submarine aircraft, and modernise Melbourne to operate the aircraft. The acquisition of 18 Douglas A-4 Skyhawk fighter bombers was also suggested, but these were dropped from the initial plan. A separate proposal to order 10 A-4G Skyhawks, a variant of the Skyhawk designed specifically for the RAN and optimized for air defense, was approved in 1965. Both aircraft types entered RAN service in 1968, with the trackers operated by 816 Squadron RAN and 851 Squadron RAN, and the Skyhawks by 805 Squadron RAN and 724 Squadron RAN. The aircraft did not fly from Melbourne until the conclusion of her refit in 1969. In 1969, the RAN purchased another 10 A-4G Skyhawks, instead of the proposed 7th and 8th Oberon-class submarines. Melbourne operated a standard air group of 4 Skyhawks, 6 trackers, and 10 Wessex helicopters until 1972, when the Wessexes were replaced with 10 Westland Sea King anti-submarine warfare helicopters, and the number of Skyhawks doubled. Although replaced by the Sea King, up to 3 Wessex helicopters could be carried as search and rescue aircraft. On 5 December 1976, a fire at the Naval Air Station HMAS Albatross destroyed or heavily damaged 12 of the Fleet Air Arm's 13 S-2E trackers. The carrier was sent to the United States in 1977 to transport back 16 S-2G tracker aircraft as replacements. Over the course of her career, over 30 aircraft were either lost or heavily damaged while operating operating from Melbourne. The majority of the aircraft ditched or crashed over the side, but some losses were due to catapult or arrestor cable failures. After Melbourne was decommissioned, the Fleet Air Arm ceased fixed-wing combat aircraft operation in 1984, with the final tracker flight saluting the decommissioned carrier. Roll. Melbourne was the third and final conventional aircraft carrier to operate with the RAN. Following the first decommissioning of sister ship HMAS Sydney in 1958, Melbourne became the only aircraft carrier in Australian service. Melbourne was unavailable to provide air cover for the RAN for up to 4 months in every year. This time was required for refits, refueling, personnel leave, and non-carrier duties, such as the transportation of troops or aircraft. Although one of the largest ships to serve in the RAN, Melbourne was one of the smallest carriers to operate in the post-World War II period. A decision was made in 1959 to restrict Melbourne's role to helicopter operations only, but was reversed shortly before its planned 1963 implementation. As well as an operational aircraft carrier, Melbourne was flagship of the RAN, a role she received almost immediately following her 1956 arrival in Australia and fulfilled until her decommissioning in 1982. During her service, the carrier was deployed overseas on 35 occasions, visited over 22 countries, and was seen as the physical and psychological centerpiece of the RAN fleet. As Melbourne was the only ship of her size in the RAN, the carrier underwent a regular rotation of commanding officers to give them experience. Commanding officers were changed on average every 15 months, with few remaining on board for more than 2 years. The majority of Melbourne's commanders later reached flag rank. The carrier was also called on to perform underway replenishments and command and control functions.